5 in the morning, the USS Gerald R. Ford was positioned exactly 60 miles off the Iranian coast, her massive nuclear-powered hull cutting a steady path through the midnight blue waters of the Persian Gulf. On the 4-acre flight deck, the deceptive calm of the night had been replaced by the controlled chaos of a full-scale combat launch. This was the beginning of Operation Blind Sight, a mission with a singular, uncompromising objective: the total neutralization of every early warning and engagement radar along the Iranian coastline. The humid Gulf air was heavy, smelling of salt spray, and the sharp, chemical bite of JP-5 jet fuel that shimmered in the amber floodlights. Above the flight deck, the stars were beginning to fade, but the horizon remained a black void that offered no hint of the violence soon to follow. Inside the primary flight control tower, the air boss monitored the synchronized movement of over 40 aircraft being positioned with surgical precision by the deck crews. Every sailor on the deck, dressed in color-coded jerseys, moved with the discipline of a unit that had spent months preparing for this specific moment of high-intensity conflict. The purple-shirted fuel crews disconnected the last of the lines, while the red-shirted ordnance teams performed final checks on the missiles clinging to the underwing hardpoints of the strike fighters. At 5:15 in the morning, the first of the EA-18 Gulf Growlers moved onto catapult number 1, its electronic warfare pods already humming with latent power. The pilot of the lead Growler looked toward the catapult officer, who knelt and pointed a glowing wand toward the dark expanse of the sea ahead. A sudden, violent hiss of steam erupted from the catapult track, and the 70,000-pound aircraft was hurled from 0 to 160 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. The shockwave of the launch punched through the air, a physical weight that vibrated in the chests of everyone standing within 100 feet of the track. 3 seconds later, the second Growler followed, its twin engines screaming as they pushed the aircraft into a steep climb to join the orbit of the first. By 5:25 in the morning, 12 FA-18 strike fighters had been launched, followed by 4 F-35 Bravo stealth fighters that disappeared from sight almost instantly. This first wave represented the hammer and the scalpel of Carrier Air Wing 8, carrying enough firepower to redefine the regional balance of power before the sun cleared the horizon. The tactical plan was a masterpiece of electronic and kinetic coordination, beginning with the suppression of the enemy's sensory organs before the killing blow was delivered. The Growlers would take the lead, using their advanced jamming suites to flood the Iranian air defense frequencies with a wall of white noise and digital ghosts. Behind them, the FA-18 fighters carried loads of AGM-88 HARM missiles, weapons specifically designed to home in on the signals of active radar installations. The pilots flew in radio silence, their cockpits illuminated only by the soft green and blue glow of the multifunction displays showing their position at coordinates 26 degrees north, 54 degrees east. Every man and woman in the air knew that the next 30 minutes would determine the success of the entire campaign, as they raced toward a coastline bristling with danger. The strike package formed up in the darkness, a lethal formation of steel and silicon moving at 800 kilometers per hour toward the unsuspecting coastal batteries. Down in the Combat Direction Center of the USS Gerald R. Ford, senior officers watched the blue icons on the digital displays as they crossed the invisible line into contested airspace. There was no turning back now. The first shots of the conflict were already being calculated by the flight computers of the lead aircraft. The air wing was no longer a collection of individual pilots and machines, but a single, integrated weapon system aimed directly at the heart of the enemy's defenses. As the Iranian coastline appeared on the long-range infrared sensors, the order for weapons free was transmitted through secure, encrypted data links. 5:30 in the morning. The leading edge of the strike package was no longer a visual formation, but a wall of invisible, high-energy radiation. 4 EA-18 Gulf Growlers, the specialized electronic warfare variants of the Super Hornet, flew in a staggered trail formation at 30,000 feet. Inside the cramped cockpits, the electronic warfare officers known as Ravens were not looking through their glass canopies at the dark Iranian coastline. Instead, their world was defined by the high-definition displays of the AN/ALQ-99 tactical jamming system. The air inside the cockpit smelled of recycled oxygen and the faint ozone scent of high-voltage electronics working at maximum capacity. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic drone of the twin engines and the occasional chirp of the digital threat warning receiver. The Growlers were currently 40 miles off the coast, positioned to create a massive cone of silence, for the strike fighters following 10 miles behind them. As the aircraft reached their designated station, the electronic warfare officers engaged the primary jamming suites. Instantly, the underwing pods began pumping out hundreds of kilowatts of radio frequency energy, targeted specifically at the Iranian early warning radar bands. On the ground, in hardened concrete bunkers buried beneath the coastal mountains, the effect was immediate and catastrophic for the defenders. The long-range surveillance screens, which seconds ago had shown a clear sky, were suddenly overwhelmed by a blinding sheet of electronic snow. The Iranian operators at the coastal sites near Bandar Abbas frantically attempted to switch frequencies, but the Growlers' onboard computers tracked their movements in milliseconds, following every jump with a concentrated beam of interference. It was a digital strangulation, a systematic blinding of the enemy's eyes, before the first kinetic blow was ever struck. The Ravens, in the back seats of the Growlers, monitored the effectiveness of their work through the digital spectrum analyzers. They could see the Iranian radars searching, sending out pulses that hit the wall of American jamming and failed to return a coherent signal. The electronic environment was a chaotic battlefield of overlapping waves, with the Growlers acting as the conductors of a massive, silent orchestra. They weren't just blocking signals. They were injecting false targets, creating hundreds of digital ghosts that appeared to be incoming bombers from a dozen different directions. All pods radiating. The lead electronic warfare officer reported over the secure Have-Quick radio system, targeting the HQ-9 and SA-20 batteries. The screen is white. They are blind. The tactical importance of this phase could not be overstated. Without the Growlers, the strike package would be flying into a dense web of surface-to-air missiles. With them, the Iranian air defense network was reduced to a collection of isolated units unable to communicate or coordinate a response. The Growlers adjusted their flight path, banking slowly to maintain their position over the electronic horizon. The vibration of the airframe changed slightly as the jamming pods drew more power from the engines, the sheer amount of electricity being converted into interference heat. As the strike fighters began their final descent toward the coast, the Growlers shifted their focus. They began spot jamming the specific frequencies used by the Iranian fire control radars. These were the high-frequency systems used to guide missiles to their targets. By flooding these narrow bands, the Growlers ensured that even if a missile was launched blindly, it would have no track to follow. The Iranian coastline was now only 20 miles away. In the dim light of pre-dawn, the silhouettes of the mountains began to emerge against the sky. But for the Iranian radar crews, the world remained a flickering, useless mess of white noise. The electronic vanguard had succeeded. The front door to the Iranian airspace had been kicked open, not with explosives, but with the focused power of the electromagnetic spectrum. The path was now clear for the strike fighters to deliver their ordnance with surgical precision. The EA-18 Gulf Growlers maintained their orbits, their sensors reaching out like invisible fingers, feeling for any sign of a radar system that had managed to stay dark to avoid detection. They were the hunters of the invisible, ensuring that the only thing the defenders would see of the American strike wing would be the fireballs of their own installations erupting in the dark. 5:40 in the morning. The Iranian coastline, a jagged silhouette of limestone and sand, loomed through the tactical displays of the strike package. The first group of 8 FA-18 fighters, divided into 2 flights of 4, descended to a mere 200 meters above the surface of the Persian Gulf. At this altitude, the pilots could feel the physical vibration of the aircraft reacting to the ground effect. The cushion of air compressed between their wings and the water. They were now crossing the dead line, the point where they transitioned from the open sea to the rugged terrain of the Jask Peninsula. The salt spray from the choppy waters had left a thin, white crust on the leading edges of the wings, but the pilots' attention was focused entirely on their terrain-following radars. To their left and right, the dark shapes of the coastal mountains rose like sleeping giants, their peaks reaching 3,000 meters into the humid air. The air at this level was turbulent, tossed by the thermal currents rising from the cooling desert sands, causing the 30-ton fighters to buck and heave like small boats in a storm. Crossing the beach, the lead pilot of the first flight announced, his voice steady despite the 10G turns he was preparing to execute. Coordinates 25 degrees 41 minutes north, 57 degrees 46 minutes east, moving to low-level ingress. The strike package was now flying through the radar shadows of the coastal range, using the Earth itself as a shield against any Iranian sensors that might have survived the initial electronic onslaught. The pilots switched their displays to the forward-looking infrared system, which turned the pitch-black world outside into a high-contrast landscape of glowing heat signatures. The desert floor appeared as a dull gray, while the paved coastal roads and military installations shone with the residual heat of the previous day's sun. Every pilot in the formation was acutely aware that while the Growlers had blinded the Iranian radars, they were still vulnerable to older, more primitive threats. Mobile anti-aircraft guns and shoulder-fired infrared missiles did not require a radar signature to kill. The crews kept their eyes moving, scanning the dark ridges for the telltale flash of a missile launch or the rhythmic thumping of a heavy machine gun. The internal cockpits remained dark, the only light coming from the faint green glow of the heads-up displays that projected altitude, speed, and heading directly onto the pilot's field of vision. The mission was now a race against the dawn. In the east, a thin sliver of orange was beginning to bleed into the sky, threatening to reveal the American fighters to the observers on the ground. The strike group adjusted their course, weaving through a narrow canyon that served as a natural corridor toward their primary targets inland. The smell of jet exhaust and hydraulic fluid was thick in the cockpit, a familiar, metallic scent that anchored the pilots to their machines as they pushed deeper into hostile territory. In the back of the strike package, two E-2 Charlie Hawkeye aircraft circled 60 miles out at sea, acting as the eyes in the sky for the entire operation. Their massive rotating radar domes monitored the entire southern half of Iran, looking for any signs of an Iranian Air Force scramble. The Hawkeye controllers watched the digital map, seeing the blue icons of the strike fighters moving steadily toward the red clusters that represented the Iranian integrated air defense system. The tactical situation was approaching its first critical inflection point. The strike fighters were now only 5 minutes from their initial release points. The mission planners back on the USS Gerald R had selected 12 specific nodes, hardened radar bunkers, mobile transporter erector launchers, and signal relay towers that formed the backbone of the Iranian coastal defense. If these nodes were destroyed, the entire southern sector of the country would become a blind spot for the Iranian military. The pilots checked their weapons status one last time. Each FA-18 fighter was carrying a mix of AGM-154 joint standoff weapons and AGM-88 HARM missiles. These were fire-and-forget munitions, capable of navigating themselves to a target based on GPS coordinates or by riding a radar beam to its source. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent current that connected the 40 pilots as they transitioned from the stealthy ingress to the violent reality of the strike. As they cleared the final ridge of the coastal mountains, the valley opened up before them. There, illuminated by the faint morning light and the glowing heat of its own power generators, was the first target, the Bandar-e Jask early warning site. The massive, rotating lattice of its primary radar was clearly visible on the strike fighter's sensors. The trap was set, 5:45 in the morning. The strike group crested the final ridge, the Bandar-e Jask early warning site now fully exposed in their targeting pods. Inside the cockpits of the 4 lead FA-18 fighters, the digital tone of the ALR-67 radar warning receiver suddenly shifted from a slow, rhythmic pulse to a high-pitched, insistent scream. The Iranian defenders, sensing the presence of intruders through the gaps in the electronic jamming, had activated their secondary fire control systems. A Soviet-made Stu-100 surface-to-air missile battery, located 5 miles inland, began painting the American formation with a high-energy tracking beam. Contact, Magnum, Magnum, the lead pilot announced, his voice cool and mechanical. This was the brevity code for the launch of an AGM-88 HARM missile, the high-speed anti-radiation missile. With a sharp, metallic clunk, the first two missiles dropped from the underwing stations of the lead Hornet. For a heartbeat, they fell through the cold air, their seeker heads already locked onto the specific frequency of the Iranian radar. Then, the solid rocket motors ignited. A twin pillar of white-hot fire erupted from the tails of the missiles, punching a hole through the dawn as they accelerated to Mach 2 in less than 4 seconds. The heat from the exhaust was so intense it momentarily bleached the infrared sensors of the aircraft behind them. The HARM missiles did not fly a straight line. They performed a lofting maneuver, climbing steeply to 12,000 meters, to gain potential energy before diving back down toward the source of the radiation. On the ground, the Iranian radar operators saw the signal not of a plane, but of a small, incredibly fast object coming directly down the throat of their own radar beam. They had seconds to react. If they turned off the radar, the missile's internal GPS and inertial navigation system would remember the last known location. If they kept it on, they were inviting a supersonic impact. They kept it on. Desperate to get a lock on the American fighters, the first AGM-88 hit the primary transmitter of the Stu-100 battery with surgical violence. The 66-pound fragmentation warhead detonated exactly 3 meters above the radar dish, sending thousands of tungsten cubes through the sensitive electronics and the cooling lines. The dish didn't just stop spinning, it disintegrated, the impact shredding the steel lattice and igniting the diesel generators nearby. A secondary explosion followed, as the fuel tanks for the mobile control van erupted, sending a plume of oily black smoke 300 feet into the air. Impact confirmed on Target 1, the wingman reported, watching the infrared bloom on his cockpit display. The emitter is dark. Moving to Target 2. The strike was not a single event, but a synchronized wave. Across a 60-mile front, 24 HARM missiles were now in the air, each hunting a different piece of the Iranian integrated air defense system. The sky over the coastline was crisscrossed with the white, chalky trails of missile propellant, looking like a spider web woven in fire. The air smelled of burnt chemicals and the ozone of the high-altitude atmosphere. The Iranian response was fractured and panicked. Deprived of their long-range eyes by the Growlers and now losing their teeth to the HARM missiles, the local commanders began firing their surface-to-air missiles blindly into the sky, hoping for a lucky hit. Huge, telephone pole-sized missiles roared off their launchers, their tails glowing like angry stars as they arced toward the Persian Gulf. But without radar guidance, they were nothing more than expensive fireworks, tumbling harmlessly into the sea or self-destructing in the empty air. The American pilots didn't flinch. They stayed low, keeping their throttles forward, feeling the airframe groan under the stress of the high-speed ingress. The tactical situation was shifting in their favor with every passing second. The Iranian coastal defense was being systematically decapitated, its ability to see, hear, or strike back being stripped away layer by layer. As the lead flight cleared the smoking ruins of the first battery, they turned their noses toward the primary objective, the massive radar and command node at Bandar Abbas. The preliminary work was done. The outer door was off its hinges. Now, it was time for the heavy ordnance to find its mark. 5:55 in the morning. The Bandar Abbas radar node, the most sophisticated sensory hub in the region, stood as a cluster of concrete domes and rotating arrays on a high ridge overlooking the Strait of Hormuz. The air around the installation was thick with the hum of high-voltage transformers and the smell of hot machinery. Suddenly, that hum was obliterated by the scream of incoming steel. 2 flights of FA-18 fighters popped up from behind a coastal ridge, their targeting lasers painting the primary radar dome with invisible, lethal light. The lead pilots squeezed the trigger. 4 1,000-pound joint direct attack munitions separated from the aircraft, their tail fins snapping into position as they began their satellite-guided plunge. The missiles didn't just fall, they accelerated, carving through the humid air with a low, predatory whistle. The first warhead punched straight through the reinforced concrete roof of the Central Command bunker, the delayed action fuse waiting until it reached the heart of the facility before detonating. A fraction of a second later, the structure vanished in a blinding white flash that bleached the morning sky. The explosion didn't just break the building, it pulverized it. 10-ton slabs of concrete were thrown 500 meters into the air like gravel, while a pressure wave of superheated gas expanded outward at 3,000 meters per second. The primary radar array, a massive steel lattice the size of a 5-story building, was hit by the shockwave and snapped at its base. It toppled over, crushing the secondary power station beneath it, which erupted in a secondary sequence of blue-white electrical arcs and fire. The Iranian defenders responded with desperate manual fire. A battery of 23mm anti-aircraft guns opened up from a nearby hillside, their tracers sowing a frantic line of fire across the sky. The rounds tore through the air, but the American fighters had already banked into a 6G turn, their engines dumping heat flares that looked like a cascade of golden sparks. One Iranian gunner managed to walk his fire onto the trailing edge of a Hornet, the high-explosive shells shredding the right horizontal stabilizer. The pilot felt the aircraft shudder violently, the flight control system fighting to compensate for the lost surface, but he held the nose steady and stayed in the fight. Black smoke now boiled from the remains of the Bandar Abbas node, a column of carbon so thick it blotted out the rising sun. The brain of the coastal defense was dead. Where there had been a sophisticated network of electronic eyes, there was now only a smoking crater and the sound of secondary explosions, as ammunition stores cooked off in the intense heat. The radar screens across the rest of the country went black as the data link was severed. The silence that followed the initial strike lasted only a few seconds before the radio channels of the surrounding Iranian units erupted, in a chaotic overlap of voices screaming for orders that would never come. 6 in the morning. The Iranian Air Force scrambled its remaining assets from the tactical air bases at Bandar Abbas and Shiraz, desperate to challenge the American dominance of their airspace. 4 F-4 Phantom fighters, aging but still lethal twin-engine interceptors, roared down the runways with their afterburners, casting long, jagged shadows across the tarmac. The Iranian pilots were flying into a nightmare of electronic interference. As they climbed to intercept altitude, their onboard radar screens were useless, filled with the flickering strobe patterns and false targets generated by the EA-18 Gulf Growlers, still orbiting offshore. The cockpit air was cold and smelled of stale oxygen and the metallic tang of hydraulic fluid. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic drone of the twin engines and the occasional chirp of the digital threat warning receiver. Vector 320, the Iranian-led pilot commanded, his voice strained against the G-forces of the climb. He was flying by dead reckoning and ground-based radio directions, which were becoming increasingly garbled as the American jamming intensified. 30 miles to the west, the American E-2 Charlie Hawkeye detected the scramble immediately. The massive rotating radar dome atop the Hawkeye tracked the 4 heat signatures rising from the Iranian coast. The controllers inside the aircraft, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the dim glow of tactical consoles, quickly relayed the coordinates to the F-35 Bravo stealth fighters loitering at 30,000 feet. Springboard lead. You have 4 bandits climbing out of Bandar Abbas, heading 320, the Hawkeye controller reported. You are cleared to engage. Quote, the 2 F-35 Bravos, the world's most advanced multi-role stealth fighters, did not turn toward the enemy. They did not need to. Their AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radars had already locked onto the Phantoms from 50 miles away. The Iranian pilots had no idea they were being watched. Their radar warning receivers remained silent because the F-35's radar pulses were specifically designed to be low probability of intercept, blending into the background noise of the atmosphere. The American pilots, encased in their high-tech flight suits and wearing carbon fiber helmets that projected a 360-degree view of the battlefield, monitored the engagement through their digital visors. The air in the F-35 cockpits was pressurized and clean. a sharp contrast to the vibrating analog chaos of the Iranian Phantoms. Fox 3. The lead F-35 pilot whispered. 2 AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles dropped from the internal weapons bays of the stealth fighters, their sleek white bodies falling for a fraction of a second before their solid-fuel rocket motors ignited. The missiles accelerated instantly to Mach 4, their active radar seekers turning on in the final seconds of flight. The Iranian pilots finally realized they were under attack when their cockpit alarms erupted in a frantic, high-pitched wail. But it was too late. The first AMRAAM punched through the fuselage of the lead Phantom just behind the cockpit, the high-explosive blast severing the fuel lines and the flight control cables. The aircraft turned into a spectacular ball of orange flame and black smoke, pieces of the wing and tail sections scattering across the desert floor. The second missile struck the wing root of the wingman's aircraft, the force of the impact spinning the jet into an unrecoverable flat spin before it disintegrated. The remaining 2 Iranian Phantoms broke formation, diving toward the deck in a desperate attempt to use the mountainous terrain to hide their heat signatures. They abandoned their intercept mission, their only goal now being survival. They disappeared into the deep canyons of the Zagros Mountains, their radars still jammed and their wingmen gone. Above them, the F-35 Bravos closed their weapons bay doors, their stealth profiles once again rendering them invisible to the fractured Iranian air defense network. They had protected the strike package without the enemy ever seeing a single American silhouette on a radar screen. The air at 30,000 feet remained silent and cold, the only evidence of the engagement being 2 rising columns of black smoke in the distance. 6:15 in the morning. The primary radar nodes were dead, but the Iranian military began activating their mobile reserves, the ghost units designed to survive the initial wave of a superpower strike. From concealed mountain tunnels and camouflaged palm groves, truck-mounted HQ-9 surface-to-air missile systems began to emerge. These mobile units were the most dangerous threat remaining. They could pop up, fire a salvo of 4 missiles, and relocate before a counterstrike could be coordinated. The crews moved with frantic energy, the smell of diesel exhaust and the metallic clatter of heavy equipment filling the humid morning air as they raised the vertical launch canisters toward the sky. But they were being watched by a predator they could not detect. High above, 4 F-35 Bravo fighters operated as the quarterbacks for the second wave of the strike. Using their distributed aperture system, the pilots didn't need to look at a screen. Their helmets allowed them to look through the floor of their own aircraft to see the heat signatures of the Iranian trucks 5 miles below. Target acquired, the lead F-35 pilot reported. Coordinates 27 degrees, 12 minutes north, 56 degrees, 9 minutes east. Mobile battery attempting to set up in the dry riverbed. The F-35 Bravos did not drop their own bombs. Instead, they acted as a digital designator for a flight of 4 FA-18 Hornets, trailing 10 miles behind. The stealth fighters painted the mobile targets with their high-powered lasers and shared the GPS data through the Link 16 tactical network. The air in the second wave's cockpits was thick with the scent of recycled air, and the low hum of the data link a steady, digital heartbeat of incoming target data. Rifle, the Hornet pilots called out, as they released 8 AGM-65 Maverick missiles. The missiles accelerated off the rails, their white smoke trails cutting across the orange and purple pre-dawn sky. They weren't just following a coordinate, they were homing in on the specific pulse of the F-35's laser designator. The Maverick missiles dived through the thermal layers of the atmosphere, their infrared cameras locking onto the hot engines of the Iranian missile launchers. The impact was absolute. The lead HQ-9 launcher was struck directly in the midsection, the warhead detonating into the unlaunched surface-to-air missiles still in their canisters. The resulting secondary explosion was massive, a pillar of white and red fire that vaporized the truck and everything within 30 meters of it. The force of the blast was so great, it sent a shockwave through the riverbed, collapsing the nearby canyon walls and burying the support vehicles in a cascade of limestone and dust. Within 6 minutes, 5 separate mobile batteries had been located and destroyed, The second wave had systematically hunted down the mobile reserves before they could fire a single shot. The Iranian commanders on the ground realized their mobile strategy was failing. The stealth eyes in the sky made camouflage irrelevant. The Iranian landscape below was now a map of fire. Each target location was marked by a rising column of black smoke that stood straight up in the windless morning air. The second wave had not just destroyed equipment, they had destroyed the Iranian military's belief in their ability to hide. The flight of Hornets banked hard toward the south, their fuel gauges dropping toward the recovery threshold. The air around the aircraft was turbulent, filled with the heat of the rising sun and the cooling debris of the destroyed batteries. The mission was entering its most dangerous phase, the strike against the hardened command core. 6:30 in the morning. Deep beneath the limestone ridges of the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian Southern Sector Command Center sat, behind 40 meters of reinforced concrete and granite. While the surface was a graveyard of twisted radar arrays and burning trucks, this subterranean fortress remained operational. It was the nervous system of the coastal defense, connected to the remaining batteries by buried fiber optic cables that the electronic jamming could not touch. Inside the command bunker, the air was stale and cold, smelling of ozone, floor wax, and the mounting sweat of 200 officers, trying to make sense of a war they could no longer see. Above them, two B-2 Spirit bombers, having flown halfway across the globe from Whiteman Air Force Base, moved into their release windows. These flying wings were invisible to the surviving Iranian sensors, their black, serrated silhouettes blending perfectly into the fading night sky. The internal weapons bays swung open with a heavy, hydraulic thud, exposing two GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrators, 30,000-pound bunker busters designed for exactly this target. "Weapon away," the mission commander whispered. The massive bombs fell in silence, their GPS fins guiding them into a vertical dive. They accelerated until they broke the sound barrier, the steel casings screaming as they tore through the air. The first bomb hit the mountain at a precise angle, the hardened steel nose cone punching through 20 meters of solid rock, before the first delay fuse triggered. The earth didn't just shake, it rippled. The primary warhead detonated inside the granite shelf, creating a subterranean shockwave that compressed the air inside the command bunker to the point of ignition. The concrete walls, reinforced with 3-inch rebar, shattered into fine dust. The light fixtures exploded, and the heavy steel blast doors were blown off their hinges, flying through the corridors like shrapnel. A second bomb followed 3 seconds later, driving into the same hole and detonating in the cavity created by the first. The mountain itself seemed to groan. On the surface, the ridge collapsed inward, swallowing the ventilation shafts and the hidden antenna farms in a massive landslide of rock and fire. The brain of the plate, Iranian southern defense, was not just silenced, it was buried. A cloud of pulverized stone and gray smoke billowed out of the mountain's entry tunnels, a physical exhale of the destruction below. In an instant, the remaining Iranian units along the coast lost all direction. The data links went dead. The radio frequencies fell silent. The command structure had been decapitated by a blow delivered from 30,000 feet. The silence that followed the deep, muffled thuds of the bunker busters was absolute, broken only by the distant, receding whine of the American jet engines. 6:45 in the morning. The mission objectives were complete, and the order for immediate withdrawal was transmitted across the encrypted green channel. The strike packages, now lighter and more agile after shedding their heavy ordnance, banked hard toward the south. The FA-18 Hornets and F-35 Bravos climbed into the brightening sky, their silver and gray skins catching the first direct rays of the sun. But the withdrawal was not a simple flight home. The Iranian military, though blinded and broken, began a desperate attempt at long-range pursuit. From inland bases, a final flight of 4 Mirage phone interceptors had managed to get airborne, guided by the last functioning long-range civilian radar at Shiraz. They were pushing their engines to the limit, their afterburners glowing like white-hot needles against the morning haze. They were closing the gap from the northeast, their pilots knowing this was a one-way mission. Inside the cockpits of the American strike fighters, the pilots monitored their fuel states with growing concern. The high-speed, low-altitude ingress and the violent maneuvers of the climax combat had consumed 40% more JP-5 fuel than the Blue Line projections had anticipated. The smell of the cockpit was now a mix of dry oxygen and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Fuel state low. We are at bingo plus 200. The lead pilot of the Hornet flight reported. We need the tankers on station at the recovery point. 40 miles offshore, 2 KC-135 Stratotankers were waiting, orbiting in a safe box guarded by 2 F-22 Raptors. The tankers were massive, slow-moving targets, their wings heavy with thousands of gallons of fuel. As the strike fighters crossed the coastline and headed back over the open water of the Persian Gulf, the tankers extended their refueling drogues, long, flexible hoses with a basket-like funnel at the end. The refueling process was a delicate dance performed at 500 kilometers per hour. The Hornet pilots had to guide their refueling probes into the small, swaying baskets while maintaining a stable formation in the turbulent morning air. The air around the tankers was thick with the scent of raw jet fuel and the heat shimmering off the massive engines. One by one, the strike fighters plugged in, receiving the lifeblood of fuel that would allow them to reach the carrier. As the last Hornet disconnected from the tanker, the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye issued a final warning. Bandits are still closing. Range 30 miles. Speed Mach 1.2. The 2 F-22 Raptors, which had been silent and invisible until now, accelerated toward the interceptors. They didn't need to fire. They simply painted the Iranian mirages with a high-intensity radar lock. The Iranian pilots, seeing their cockpit displays light up with the unmistakable signature of the world's premier air dominance fighter, realized the hopelessness of their position. They broke their pursuit, banking back toward the Iranian mainland and disappearing from the American screens. The strike group was now clear. The coast of Iran was a jagged line of smoke and fire on the horizon, receding as they flew south toward the safety of the carrier strike group. The tension in the cockpits began to ease, replaced by the heavy, bone-deep exhaustion of a combat mission. The pilots could see the white wake of the USS Gerald R Ford in the distance, a small, comforting V-shape in the middle of the deep blue sea. 7 in the morning. The sun was now a blinding orange disk, sitting just above the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the flight deck of the USS Gerald R Ford. The carrier had turned into the wind, maintaining a steady 30 knots to create the necessary headwind for recovery operations. On the deck, the yellow-shirted plane directors and green-shirted hook runners were back in position. The air was thick with the smell of salt spray, burnt rubber from previous landings, and the heavy heat radiating from the ship's 4 massive steam catapults. The recovery phase of a combat strike was often the most dangerous. Pilots were exhausted, fuel states were critical, and the aircraft often carried the invisible stress of combat damage. The first aircraft in the stack was the lead EA-18 Gulf Growlers. It appeared as a small black speck against the morning haze, its wings dirty and its engines whistling as it descended toward the ship. The pilot adjusted his glide slope. His eyes locked on the meatball, the Fresnel lens optical landing system on the port side of the deck. 603. Hornet ball 5.2. The pilot called out, indicating his aircraft number, his visual on the lights, and his remaining fuel in thousands of pounds. The Growler slammed onto the deck at 150 miles per hour. Its tailhook snagged the number 3 arresting wire with a violent, metallic clack that echoed through the entire ship. The steel cable, 2 inches thick, zipped out across the deck, absorbing the massive kinetic energy of the 30-ton aircraft and bringing it to a dead stop in less than 300 feet. The pilot slammed the throttles to full power, a standard safety procedure in case the hook missed the wire before cutting the engines as the aircraft was jerked backward by the tension of the cable. One by one, the strike fighters followed. The FA-18 Hornets came in every 45 seconds, a rhythmic sequence of screaming engines and slamming steel. The deck crews moved like clockwork, unhooking the wires and directing the aircraft to the finger. parking areas near the edge of the deck to make room for the next arrival. The most tense moment came when the damaged Hornet from the Bandar Abbas strike approached the ship. Its right horizontal stabilizer was a jagged mess of shredded carbon fiber and exposed hydraulic lines. The pilot had to fight the controls, the aircraft wanting to roll violently to the left as it slowed to landing speed. The air boss in the tower held his breath as the damaged fighter crossed the round down at the back of the ship. The aircraft hit the deck hard, bouncing once before the hook caught the number 2 wire. The plane slewed sideways, the tires smoking. As the pilot fought to keep it on the center line, it held. The green-shirted maintenance crews swarmed the aircraft as soon as the engines died. They weren't looking for fuel, they were looking for battle damage. They ran their hands over the fuselage, feeling for the jagged edges of shrapnel holes, or the greasy smear of leaking hydraulic fluid. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits, their flight suits soaked in sweat, their faces marked by the deep indentations of their oxygen masks. There were no cheers, there was only the quiet, professional exchange of data between the pilots and the intelligence officers waiting on the deck. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford was now a crowded parking lot of high-performance machinery. The smell of hot metal and cooling engines was overwhelming. The air wing had returned. Out of 42 aircraft launched, 42 had returned to the deck. The first phase of Operation Blind Sight was over, but the work of the technicians and the ordnance crews was just beginning as they prepared for the potential of a second sortie. 7:30 in the morning. Deep inside the windowless hull of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Carrier Intelligence Center was a hive of quiet, concentrated energy. The air was kept at a steady 65 degrees to protect the rows of high-performance servers, creating a crisp, sterile environment that smelled of ozone and fresh coffee. On the massive digital displays at the front of the room, the primary data feed from a Global Hawk drone orbiting at 60,000 feet over the Iranian coast began to scroll. These were the first high-resolution images of the strike zones, processed through synthetic aperture radar that could see through the thick black smoke still rising from the targets. Intelligence officers, their eyes bloodshot from a night without sleep, sat at workstations using digital light tables to compare the before and after satellite imagery. They weren't just looking for fire. They were looking for the specific kill signatures of the mission's objectives. Target Alpha 1, Northern Coastal Terminal, a senior analyst announced, circling a cluster of blackened craters on his screen. The primary lattice is down. We have a total breach of the central transmitter housing. The heat signature indicates the cooling systems have failed. Emitter is 100% neutralized. The reports continued with clinical efficiency. At the main naval hub, the images showed the catastrophic collapse of the mountaintop radar dome. The guided munitions had done more than destroy the equipment. They had destabilized the limestone foundation of the site. What had been a sophisticated radar installation was now a pile of gray rubble, with secondary fires still burning in the underground fuel bunkers. The analyst noted that the surviving foreign personnel were attempting to set up a primitive signal relay using a portable antenna, but it was being systematically jammed by the airborne command aircraft still on station. The assessment for the hardened core, the subterranean command center, was the most critical. The drone's thermal sensors showed massive plumes of heat venting from the mountain's elevator shafts, a clear sign of the chimney effect, caused by the internal detonations of the bunker busters. The southern sector command is dark, the lead intelligence officer reported. We have 0 electronic emissions from the interior site. All fiber optic nodes are unresponsive. The foreign coastal defense network is now a series of isolated islands with no central coordination. The casualty figures for the foreign side were estimated based on the destruction of the mobile batteries and the collapse of the bunkers. The report noted that 84 foreign radar and missile technicians were confirmed killed in the initial strike on the main hub, with hundreds more missing in the collapse of the mountain facility. On the American side, the tally was miraculous. 0 aircraft lost, 0 personnel killed, and only 1 Hornet requiring extensive structural repair. As the final assessment was compiled into a briefing for Defense Headquarters, the silence in the room reflected the gravity of the data. The mission had achieved total sensory dominance. For a stretch of 300 miles along the Persian Gulf, The foreign military was effectively blind. They could no longer track ships in the strait, they could no longer guide their long-range missiles, and they could no longer coordinate their air force. The commander looked at the final tally on the screen. The radar map of southern Iran, which had been a dense web of red, overlapping circles only 3 hours ago, was now almost entirely blue. The path for any following operations, amphibious landings, or deeper inland strikes was wide open. The electronic and kinetic decapitation was complete. 8 in the morning. The sun had climbed high over the horizon, turning the Persian Gulf into a sheet of polished blue glass that mirrored the cloudless sky. On the bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the tension of the early morning hours had settled into a quiet, professional rhythm. The air was cool, smelling of the ship's filtered ventilation and the faint, metallic scent of the ocean below. The commanding officer stood at the forward windows, his binoculars lowered as he looked out over the flight deck. The last of the strike aircraft were now tucked away on the hangar deck or chained down in their parking spots, their engines silent and their skin cooling in the humid air. Operation Blind Sight was officially over. The final mission report, encrypted and transmitted to Pacific Command, confirmed the strategic reality. The Iranian integrated air defense system along the coast had ceased to exist as a functional entity. The radar screens at the Iranian Defense Headquarters in Tehran were now filled with static and system failure alerts. The eyes of the coast had been put out, leaving a 300-mile gap in their early warning network that would take months, if not years, to rebuild. The carrier strike group began its transition from an offensive strike posture back to a defensive screen. The escorts, 2 destroyers and a cruiser adjusted their positions, their sonar, domes, and radar arrays continuing to scan the depths and the skies for any sign of a retaliatory strike that would likely never come. The Iranian military was in a state of total paralysis, their communications fractured, and their leadership buried in the ruins of the Zagros Mountains. In the ready rooms, the pilots of Air Wing 8 sat in their flight suits, decompressing as they filled out their post-flight logs. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the heavy, leaden weight of physical and mental fatigue. They spoke in low tones, recounting the moments of impact and the sight of the HARM missiles streaking toward their targets. There was no celebration. There was only the grim satisfaction of a professional job performed with absolute precision. The deck of the Ford was now quiet. The steam from the catapults had dissipated, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the rigging and the distant hum of the ship's nuclear reactors. The massive carrier continued its steady course through the Gulf, a mobile fortress of steel and fire that had just demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of modern American power. The strategic silence following the strike was the most telling result of the mission. No Iranian missiles were launched in retaliation. No fast boats emerged from the hidden coves. The neutralization was so complete that the enemy had lost even the ability to strike back. In anger, the Strait of Hormuz remained open, and the threat to international shipping had been effectively neutralized. As the morning progressed, the crew of the Ford prepared for the next watch. The ship was a city that never slept, and while the strike was over, the mission of maintaining the peace through superior force continued. The sun continued to rise, illuminating the white wake of the carrier as it moved toward the open sea, leaving the smoking coastline of Iran far behind.